you do very interesting work. So I want to get to the Mexican slavery piece because I don't think in North America we think of slavery beyond much about what we did or what happened in the islands before liberation, and yet there's a sadness to the story in Mexico that's just as profound as ours.
Oh yeah, well there's a curious difference between the two slaveries, that the two systems of slavery. The Spaniards, when Cortez conquered Mexico, they had a very hip attitude toward slavery, that they didn't buy slaves from Africa or anything. They would just enslave the native population. And so when they conquered Mexico, there were over 30 million indigenous people living in Mexico, and a lot of them, the Spaniards killed a lot of them inadvertently through the diseases, smallpox, measles, right, whatever. But they also in 1565, the Spaniards had a silver strike called El Rufo, and they discovered almost overnight that Mexico was one gigantic mountain of silver. And as soon as they discovered that, the days were numbered for the native population, and they just enslaved them. They had no rights. They just enslaved them promiscuously into the silver mines, the gold mines, in the different haciendas, and worked them to death in the fields. And within about less than 100 years from that moment, they had reduced the indigenous population from over 30 million down to less than 1 million. And they were in the process of going extinct. And the Catholic Church, which had been relatively cruel in their attitude toward colonization, they actually intervened. And they said, these people that, we may not think much of them, but they've got souls to be saved for Jesus. Therefore, there was no penalty for killing Indians. And they said, you're not allowed to kill Indians for no reason at all anymore. And you cannot work them to death in your fields and your mines. So that but at that point, the Spaniards had basically raped anything that stood still long enough, and they had a very large mestizo population.
But I want to pause that for just a second, and I want to say it was in some ways, between the Aztecs and the Mayans, those were already brutal and sometimes violent societies, but it was nothing compared to about what was going to happen to them when the Spaniards got there.
Yeah, during the next 130 years after Cortez landed, there had been approximately 33 million indigenous peoples in Mexico, and there were fewer than a million left. And that is, you could imagine what the Mexican people were going through during that period. It was going through they had 130 years of Hiroshima, of the Gulag Archipelago, of the Holocaust. Right. They were and what you talk about really prolonged lethal suffering. It was a great die-off. It was like a great extinction event. And that, the Mexican people, they have enormous stoicism, enormous fatalism, enormous right. courage beyond unimaginable courage. And I think a lot of that was forged during that period when 98% of the population
right.
died horrible, painful, agonizing deaths.
Yeah, it was a Holocaust of enormous proportions, yeah. and in a fairly, as you mentioned, a pretty quick period of time, and that has a way of imprinting on a nation's soul, just like our own slavery did, which is part of why Abraham Lincoln and others were trying to abolish it. They knew it was staining our soul as a country, and that we had to eradicate that. But let's compare that to slavery in the U.S., because when slavery was starting in the United States, they weren't using African slaves, and they were trying to use the enslaved Native American population, but that never worked out. Can we address the difference between the American style slavery and Mexican slavery?
And it's the differences between American slavery Mexican slavery are really quite profound and quite interesting. One of the small but extremely important differences is that the Diaz did not believe in breaking up slave families, and there was a reason for it. That he felt that if the husband father was there with his family, he would be less likely to attempt to escape. He would not want to abandon his family, and one of the effects, and Diaz had enslaved well over 50% of the population, and so these were people that the Mexican people came out of profound slavery. But one of the effects that had in not breaking up the families and keeping them together, that they developed a very profound sense of the nuclear family. But that unlike American slavery, where they had no qualms at all about busting up, families.
Yeah, it's based on that. It's based on
for very mercenary reasons. They didn't break the families up. But the American slavery was really bad, but where it really turned bad was in around 1840. The English perfected the steam-driven spinning mill, and practically overnight, that they could sell unlimited quantities of cotton for a lot of money. And at one point, cotton became so valuable that and of course the American South, particularly the Deep South, had a global monopoly on cotton production, and so that the only thing standing between them and unlimited profits were they were having a sufficient number of slaves. So they began buying up every slave they could get their hands on. That's where the expression "sell them down the river" came from. Mm-hmm. If you were living in Missouri and you had some slaves, you could sell them for an enormous amount of money in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, whatever.
Interesting.
Then then the abuse of the slaves became horrendous.
Yeah.
The southern plantation owners had led an extremely profligate lifestyle. They were extremely ostentatious, always throwing lavish balls. That they were degenerate gamblers. That they were big horse races, big card games. They were betting everything they had. In the summers, that they're afraid of malaria, yellow fever, and what. So they'd take their families to New York City, and while they're in New York City, they would borrow money from the New York banks. And you know what they used for collateral? Slaves. They actually had on the mortgages. They had slaves down for, collateralizing the loans, and and so they really began working the slaves just hideously. And of course, the things they feared most of all were slaves had run away, and that's when the abolition movement in the North coincidentally started to grow, and the slaves did want to leave. They were being worked to death. And horribly and beaten if they didn't make their quotas, and but also they feared slave rebellions, and so it really got very, very bad. And the slavery it was always bad, but it got really horrible in the Deep South for the